The frost is coming. She said it out loud, standing in the middle of 300 wolves who were too drunk on harvest ale to hear anything quieter than their own laughter. She said it to the one person who needed to hear it most. He exiled her for saying it. 4 days later, the horses froze. All 12 of them, in a single night, their bodies stiff and white in their stalls like sculptures carved from something that used to be alive. The well water turned black. Not murky, not discolored. Black, the way a mirror is black when it reflects a sky with no stars in it. 2 sentries stopped breathing on the north wall, and nobody found them until the morning shift change because the cold had taken them so quietly that they looked like men still standing at their posts. The Alpha King sent a messenger south across the ridge, a young wolf, barely 20, with frost already forming on the edges of his collar before he cleared the gate. He found her sitting outside a shallow cave with her back against the granite and her hands in her lap. And he delivered the message the way you deliver something you have been told to say, but do not fully understand. Come back, she did not move. Tell him, I warned him. The messenger ran. By nightfall, the fires inside the fortress wall stopped giving heat. The flames still burned. The wood still crackled and popped and threw sparks into the dark. But the warmth that should have radiated outward from them simply did not. As if the mechanism connecting fire to heat had been quietly disconnected while nobody was paying attention. And she was still on the wrong side of the walls, waiting. But I need to go back. Before the exile. Before the frost. Before any of it. I need to start where it actually started, which was the night everything was still good and nobody believed it wouldn't stay that way. You can always tell when a pack is happy. The noise changes shape. It stops being individual voices and becomes something collective. A single living sound made up of 300 smaller sounds, all of them running together until the edges blur. On the night of the harvest feast, the ashen main courtyard was so loud the sound bounced off the stone walls and came back at you from 2 directions at once, and standing inside it felt like standing inside the chest of something enormous that was laughing. 3 fire pits burning, meat on every table, ale poured so many times the ground around the barrels had gone dark and sticky with it. Kaelric Ashen had promised his people the best harvest in a decade, and he had delivered. And now 300 wolves were celebrating in the particular way that wolves celebrate when they believe the hard part is behind them. Chest thumping, back slapping, children chasing each other between the legs of warriors who pretended not to notice. The kind of noise that says we made it through another year and nothing is coming for us. I was not at the feast. Not yet. I was in the lower quarters, kneeling on the cold stone floor of a room that smelled like tallow and sour milk and the particular sharp sweetness of a child running a fever. Brielle was sitting on the edge of her cot with her son in her arms, rocking him the way mothers rock when they have run out of other options and movement is the only comfort left. The boy was 18 months old and burning up, his small body radiating heat that had nothing to do with health, and his breath coming in the shallow, rapid pattern that I had learned to recognize years ago as the sound a body makes when it is fighting something it may not win against. Nobody had come. The healers were at the feast. The senior wolves were at the feast. The lower quarters were empty and dark and cold, and Brielle was alone with her sick child, and the sound of celebration drifting down from the courtyard above them was the particular kind of cruelty that is not intentional, but cuts just as deep. I knelt beside her and placed my palm flat against the boy's forehead. The passive pulse read him immediately. Temperature dangerously high, but not yet critical. Lungs clear. Heart rate elevated, but steady. His body was fighting, and it was not losing, but it needed help that his mother did not have the training to give. I opened the pouch I carried on my belt. Dried willow bark. Elderflower. A pinch of something I had no proper name for that grew in the cracks of the northern ridge stones and that I had been collecting since I was old enough to understand what it did. I mixed them in Brielle's water cup with hands that were steady because steadiness was a thing I had practiced until it became automatic, the way a person practices anything they know their survival will eventually depend on. Hold his head up, I said. Just slightly. Let him swallow on his own. Brielle's hands were shaking. I placed my hand over hers on the back of the boy's head, and I felt her fingers steady under the contact, not because I was doing anything supernatural, just because sometimes the presence of someone who is not afraid is enough to quiet the fear in the person beside them. The boy swallowed, coughed once, swallowed again. Within 10 minutes, the flush had begun to recede from his cheeks, and his breathing had deepened into something closer to sleep than to struggle. Brielle pressed her forehead against the top of his head and held him, and I sat back on my heels and watched the fever break the way you watch a storm move past, with the specific relief of someone who knows how close it came. Nobody came, Brielle said quietly. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady now. I sent word 3 hours ago. Nobody came. I know, I said. I know what that is like. She looked at me. Really looked. The way people look at you when they are seeing you for the first time, despite having shared a territory with you for years. She reached out and took my hand and squeezed it once, and the gratitude in it was so specific and so simple that I carried the warmth of it with me. When I stood up and walked out into the corridor and up the stairs toward the feast, I was late. I arrived with the smell of herbs on my hands and tallow in my hair, and I stood at the far edge of the courtyard with my back against the stone wall, and I pressed my palm flat against it. Something was wrong with the ground. Not the kind of cold you feel after sundown when the stones give up the last of the day's warmth. This was different. This was the cold of a thing being drained rather than a thing simply cooling down, like pressing your hand against the chest of someone who is no longer breathing. The warmth is technically still there, but the mechanism that was making it is gone. I stood there and felt it pulling upward through the soles of my boots, and I thought about the elk I had watched leave 3 mornings ago, not migrating, running, the entire herd moving in a single sustained push that did not slow at the southern valley the way it always does, and the birds that had gone silent 2 weeks before that, not the silence of a cold front passing through. The silence of every roosting instinct firing at once, and the northern den I had found yesterday with kills still frozen in the entrance and warmth stones scattered across the floor like someone had kicked them on the way out in the middle of doing something else. I need to explain something before I tell you what happened next. Being born Omega in a pack like this one is not a punishment, though most people outside the structure treat it like one. It is a calibration. While the alphas are running toward every noise and the betas are busy managing the space between them, the omegas are doing something else entirely. We are reading the room, feeling the air pressure shift before the storm announces itself, catching the specific quality of silence that means a predator is nearby versus the silence that just means the birds got tired. We call it the passive pulse, not magic, not some mystical gift, just paying attention at a frequency that most wolves cannot be bothered with, because their survival has never depended on it. Mine always had. And what the passive pulse was telling me, standing at the edge of that celebration with 300 happy wolves between me and the truth, was that something was pulling heat out of the ground from below, working its way up through the roots and the rock and the packed earth of the courtyard floor. And every warm, laughing, ale-soaked wolf in this territory was standing on top of it and calling it a good night. I made a decision. I walked toward the king. Kelric Ashen was easy to find, not because he was loud. He was not particularly, not compared to the warriors around him, but because the courtyard organized itself around where he was standing, the way water organizes itself around a rock in a current. Broad through the shoulders, the kind of broad that comes from 20 years of actual use rather than training for appearance. His iron crown sat low on his forehead, dark and unpolished metal that looked more like something salvaged from a forge than something made for ceremony. His cloak was black wolf fur, heavy enough that the snow settling on his shoulders did not shift when he moved. Snow had caught in his beard, and he had not noticed it or had not bothered. His amber eyes moved across the courtyard in a slow, satisfied sweep. The look of a man who has kept every promise he made and knows it. I stopped 6 feet from him. The frost is coming early. Tormund turned first, broad-faced, permanently skeptical, the kind of man who treats every piece of information he does not like as a personal insult. He had a roasted rib bone in one hand, and he gestured with it vaguely in the direction I had come from. "The frost is coming early," he repeated back at me, in the particular tone people use when they are doing an impression of someone they have already decided to dismiss. 2 people near him laughed. I did not go back to where I had come from. "The elk are gone," I said, louder, loud enough that heads turned. "Not migrated. Gone. The whole herd crossed the southern grass ocean 3 days ago and did not stop. The birds on the northern boundary have been silent for 2 weeks. The wolf family at the Granite Ridge Den abandoned their site mid-season. I kept my eyes on Kelric. They left their kills behind. Wolves inside pack territory do not leave their kills." Kelric handed his cup to the man on his right without looking at him. "It is autumn," he said. "Not unkind. The way you explain something obvious to someone you are choosing not to be impatient with. Animals move south in autumn. That is not a warning. That is a season. Not like this." I held his gaze. I pressed my hand against the courtyard wall an hour ago. The heat is being pulled out of the stone from below. The freeze is working up from the earth, not down from the air. That is not weather behavior. Weather does not move that way. Around us, the celebration had developed a hole in it, a ring of people who had stopped moving. Drinks paused mid-lift. Eyes moving between me and the king. Impact structure, a moment like this has weight. An Omega addressing an Alpha publicly is not just a conversation, it is an event. Everyone in that courtyard knew what it meant for me to be standing here, and everyone was waiting to see what he would do with it. Kelric let the silence sit for exactly long enough to make clear he was choosing to respond rather than reacting. Fear spreads faster than cold, Revna. Still calm, still measured, but there was something behind the measure now. A flatness that had not been there before. He turned back toward his council, and the circle around him reformed like water closing over a gap. I stood there for another moment. Then I left. I did not go inside. The king's private solar was cold, in a way I did not think it should be, with a fire burning. He stood with his back to the hearth and his crown still on, which told me this was not an informal conversation. 2 of his senior warriors flanked the door, Voss stood behind them in the shadows, watching with the particular stillness of a man who is already composing his next counsel. "You undermined me," Kelrick said, "in front of 300 people on the night of the harvest feast. I told them what I know. You told them the ground is hungry and the animals are running." He stepped closer. His scent hit me before his shadow did. Cedar smoke and heated iron. The scent of a man whose body runs hotter than it should because the vigilance never stops. The constant metabolic broadcast of an alpha who has not slept without one eye open since the border war took 60 of his wolves 5 years ago. I noticed it the way I notice everything, automatically, involuntarily, filed alongside the other information my body was collecting about the room and the man in it. You know what that does in a crowd? By morning, half the pack will be moving stores to interior rooms, and the other half will be asking each other what the Omega knows that the King does not. "What does the King know?" I said, "that the Omega does not?" He went very still. "I know how to hold a pack together." His voice was quiet now. "I have done it through famine and plague, and a border war that took 60 of our best wolves in 8 weeks. Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger. Something older than anger, and more tired. You know what kept this pack alive through all of it? Not the stores. Not the walls. The belief that their alpha had it handled. You pull that thread, and the whole thing unravels. Leadership that ignores warning invites ruin. I said it flat and direct because I was tired and cold, and I had been carrying these signs alone for 2 weeks, and there was nothing left in me for careful diplomacy. Voss stepped forward from the shadows. His voice was smooth in the way that polished stone is smooth. "There is the matter of precedent, my king. An Omega challenging Alpha authority publicly, without consequence." He paused. "If this stands, by tomorrow every wolf in the lower quarters will believe the hierarchy is open to negotiation." I looked at Voss. He did not look back at me. His eyes were on Calric, and in them was the absolute conviction of a man who believes the structure he serves is more important than any truth that threatens it. He was not cruel. He was something more dangerous than cruel. He was certain. Calric looked at me for a long time. "You will not speak of this again. Not publicly. Not privately to anyone in this pack. You will go about your duties, and you will let me manage the winter. And if I do not..." Something shifted in the air between us. Not dramatic. Not a thunderclap moment. Just the quiet adjustment of two people who have just understood that this conversation has reached the place where it was always going. "Then I will make a decision I would prefer not to make," he said. I went to the market the next morning anyway. 4 individual conversations, each one quiet, each one specific. The river temperature, the elk behavior, the abandoned den. I gave them information and let them decide what to do with it. By midday, those 4 had become 11. By the time Tormund brought it to Calric mid-afternoon, 6 warriors had already ridden north to check the den themselves. They came back before sunset. I watched their faces when they rode through the gate. What they had found there had rearranged something behind their eyes that was not going to rearrange itself back. Calric called the assembly an hour later. He stood on the fortress steps with snow coming down in real earnest now. Heavy, purposeful flakes that had intent to them, not the thin, decorative scatter of earlier in the week. Iron crown, war-forged armor, voice carrying across the courtyard without needing to be raised. Revna Quiet Dusk is exiled beyond the southern ridge. Effective tonight. before the second snowfall. She will be provisioned with 3 days of supplies. She will not return within pack borders until I determine otherwise." He walked back inside. I was at the back of the crowd. I felt the people around me settle into new configurations. Not away from me exactly, just rearranging themselves around the shape of what had just happened, the way iron filings move when a magnet is removed. Brielle was standing at the gate when I walked south with my pack on my back. She was holding her son, and the boy was sleeping against her shoulder with the easy breathing of a child whose fever had broken because someone had bothered to come when no one else would. Brielle's face was wet, but she did not speak. She reached out and touched my arm as I passed. A brief contact, warm fingers against cold skin, the kind of touch that says everything that words would make smaller. At the top of the ridge, I stopped, turned around. Kaelric was on the rampart wall, just a silhouette of iron and fur against a sky that had given up its last light. Snow on his shoulders that he had not brushed off. His face unreadable at this distance. I turned back around and stepped between the ward stones. The moment I crossed the boundary line, the pack bond snapped. That low, constant hum of belonging that I had carried in my chest every day of my life. Gone, not faded, not dimmed, cut clean like a line pulled taut until it breaks. I stood on the other side of it and felt the absence where it had been, and I kept walking because there was nothing else to do. The gate stayed closed behind me. 3 days later, the frost began killing them. The cold on the south side of the ward stones was a different kind of cold. Not worse exactly. Just honest in a way the cold inside the territory never had to be. Inside the pack's borders, even in a hard winter, there was always that low background warmth. 300 wolves going about their lives, their collective heat bleeding into the air and the stone and the soil the way warmth always bleeds from anything alive into its surroundings. You do not notice it until it is gone. I had not known I was carrying it until the ward stones cut it off, and now every breath I took out here had a quality to it that I had not experienced before. Clean, empty, the cold of a world that had no particular opinion about whether I was in it or not. I found shelter before full dark. A shallow cave cut into the granite face of the riverbank, a 1/4 mile south of the ridge, low ceiling, dry floor. A natural windbreak at the entrance formed by 2 slabs of rock that leaned against each other at an angle that kept the worst of the wind from reaching the interior. Small enough that my body heat alone would make a difference if I stayed still and kept the fire fed and did not think too hard about the fact that the last time I had slept somewhere without the pack bond humming in my chest was never. I had never slept without it, not once in 23 years of being alive. I built a fire from pine deadfall, the dry kind that catches fast and burns hot and fills a small space with light and the smell of resin that stings the inside of your nose in a way that feels like being awake. I sat with my back against the deepest wall and my knees pulled up, and my mother's pendant resting against my collarbone. The silver warm the way it was always warm, even now, even out here where nothing else was. I had been wearing it so long I sometimes forgot it was there. A small crescent moon, the metal thin enough that it bent slightly when I pressed it between my fingers, the chain fine enough that it disappeared against my skin unless the light caught it. My mother had died the night I was born. This pendant was the only thing she had left behind, and I had worn it every day of my life, and I had never once questioned why the silver always ran warm when every other metal I touched was cold. I held it now in the dark, and felt it pulse against my palm. A tiny vibration, so faint that I had spent 23 years mistaking it for my own heartbeat. The night was wrong in a specific way I could not name yet. Not dangerous feeling, not the held breath tension of a forest with a predator moving through it. More like the feeling of standing in a room where a clock has stopped. Something that had been running constantly in the background, something so constant you had stopped registering it as a sound, had gone quiet. And now the silence where it used to be was louder than the sound itself had ever been. I pressed my palm against the cave floor. The drain was here too. Fainter than inside the courtyard, but the same quality. The same directional pull. Upward through the stone from something below. Not weather. Not the natural heat exchange of earth and air as the season turned. Something purposeful, like a drain at the bottom of a basin. Water does not decide to move toward it. It just goes because the geometry of the situation demands it. I pulled my hand back and added another branch to the fire and told myself to sleep. I did not sleep. The first night passed without incident, which I was grateful for and suspicious of in equal measure. The second day I spent close to the cave, mapping the area with the passive pulse, trying to understand the geography of what I was dealing with. The frost was denser toward the ridge, not visibly, not in any way you could point to and describe to someone else, but in pressure. The air between me and the ward stones had a weight to it that the air to the south did not, like wading toward deeper water without seeing the surface change. I went to the river in the afternoon. It ran fast this time of year normally, fed by the mountain drainage, loud enough that you could hear it from a distance as a low, continuous rush. I heard nothing as I approached. I came through the last of the tree cover and stopped at the bank and looked at it. Glass, not the white cracked ice of a river that had frozen in a cold snap, not the familiar opaque surface of a hard winter freeze. Black glass, a flat, solid mirror of it that caught the overcast sky and gave it back undistorted. No pressure cracks, no air bubbles locked in the surface, as if the water had simply decided to stop moving and had done it so completely that the transition left no evidence of the process, no memory of having ever been liquid. Just this perfect dark stillness stretching from bank to bank, and underneath it, something that should not have been there. I went down to the bank and knelt on the frozen mud at the water's edge, and pressed both palms flat against the surface. The cold bit immediately. Not the gradual seep of touching ice, but a sharp, full contact cold that went to the bone inside of 3 seconds. I held my hands there anyway, and pushed the passive pulse outward through the contact point. Thump! I pulled back slightly, pressed again. Thump. Slow. Deep. A vibration that was coming from below the ice, below the riverbed, below the earth itself, not my heartbeat. Mine was fast and shallow from the cold and the walk. This was something with an entirely different tempo. Deliberate, patient, like something very large breathing in its sleep. Something that had been breathing for a very long time, and was in no particular hurry to stop. I closed my eyes and let the passive pulse go further, following the vibration outward and downward, and in every direction at once, reading the invisible architecture of the thing around me. Here is what I understood, kneeling at that river with my hands going numb on black ice. The frost was not coming from the north. It was not coming from outside the territory at all. It was radiating outward from a central point, spreading in concentric circles the way sound spreads from a struck bell. And the center of those circles was not the mountains. It was not the wild lands beyond the boundary. The center was the fortress. The cold was coming from inside the pack's borders and moving outward. Not an invasion from outside the ward stones. A collapse from within. I pulled my hands off the ice. The cold had gone up past my wrists and my fingers were stiff, and I rubbed them together hard trying to get the blood moving. And I sat back on my heels and looked at the ridge. The ward stones were visible even from this distance in the fading afternoon light. 7 ancient granite boulders set at intervals along the ridgeline, their carved faces turned outward toward the wild. I had looked at those stones my entire life and seen them the way you see anything familiar. As background, as given, as simply part of the landscape's furniture that has always been there and will always be there and does not require your attention or your understanding, because it simply is. Tonight, their runes were flickering. I had never seen them flicker in my entire life. Those carvings had held a faint, steady blue-white light for as long as anyone in the pack could remember. Barely visible in daylight, clear on dark nights, constant as breathing. The kind of constant you stop noticing because it never changes. Now they were pulsing, irregular, the same rhythm as the vibration under the ice. The same slow, deep heartbeat that I had felt through my palms on the surface of the frozen river. I stood there at the river's edge in the failing light and watched the ward stones pulse and felt the shape of the thing I had been refusing to understand fully click into place like a key in a lock. Every wolf knows the boundary runes keep rival packs out. That is the story we are told as children. That is the simple version passed down, so the young ones understand why the ward stones matter. What the simple version leaves out, what I was only beginning to grasp standing outside them for the first time in my life, is that keeping rival packs out is the minor function. The major function is filtration. The ward stones hold back the raw ancient forces of the deep wild, the energies that predate every structure any wolf has ever built, the things that move through the earth and the air in the spaces between civilized territories. They hold all of that at the boundary, and they filter it down to something a pack can live alongside without being consumed by it. And they do not run on the alpha's authority alone. An alpha's mark renews the territorial claim. That is real, but the filtration, the actual containment work, runs on something else. A natural frequency specific to the territory's cycle. A frequency that has to be actively present inside the boundary to keep the stones powered. A frequency that had been present inside those stones my entire life, because I had been present inside those stones my entire life. I looked down at my mother's pendant where it had fallen forward when I leaned over the ice, a small silver crescent. The metal warm against the back of my hand even in this cold, the way it had always run warm. I had assumed my whole life that silver simply held temperature differently than other metals. I had never questioned it. I had never thought to question it because it had always been that way, and things that have always been a certain way become invisible. I picked it up and held it in my fingers and pushed the passive pulse into it the way I had pushed it into the river ice. It was oscillating, a tiny constant vibration. The same frequency as the ward stones on a healthy night. My mother had died the night I was born. This pendant was the only thing she had left behind, and I had worn it every day of my life. And it had been broadcasting the containment frequency into the territory every day of my life. Through me, through the ward stones, into the boundary filter that held the living freeze outside where it belonged. She had not left it behind for me to remember her by. She had left it because she knew what I was, and she knew what I would need to do. I was the anchor. I had always been the anchor. And Kelric had exiled me across the boundary line. And now the ward stones were failing, and the frost was coming from inside the territory, because the source of the filtration frequency was standing 3 miles on the wrong side of it. He did not exile a warning. I set it to the dark, to the river, to the stones that were just stones now. He broke the lock on the cage. The flickering ward stones went dark, not dim, not fading, off. 7 carved granite boulders on a ridgeline. Just rocks now, no different from any other rocks. The centuries of accumulated frequency extinguished like a lamp when someone finally forgets to refill the oil. The seal was broken. The vibration under the ice surged. I felt it through my boots, through the frozen ground, up through my legs and into my chest like a second heartbeat, forcing itself alongside my own. The frost had been pressing against the filter from outside for weeks, building pressure, testing. Now the filter was gone, and 300 wolves were sleeping inside a fortress with no barrier between them and something old and patient and very hungry. Inside the fortress walls, the dying had already begun. I could not see it. I could not hear it. But the passive pulse does not require proximity. It requires attunement. And I had been attuned to every living presence in that territory since birth. The horses were the first thing I felt go. 12 heavy, warm presences that had been part of the texture of the pack bond for as long as I could remember. They went all at once. A sudden cluster-shaped absence that hit me like a physical impact. I sat up in my sleeping roll with the fire burned down to coals and the cave entrance showing me a world that had gone very quiet. I sat there in the dark and counted the absences I could feel now where living warmth had been before. The horses, 4 sentries on the north wall whose metabolic signatures I had tracked unconsciously every night, watch for years, steady and reliable as clockwork, gone still. The particular quality of absence that is not sleep. Sleep has a rhythm to it, a depth that fluctuates. Death is flat. Death is the line that does not move. I pressed my fist against my mouth and held the pendant tight enough that the crescent edge bit into my palm, and I stayed very still until the urge to cross those boundary stones without permission passed. It took a while. It took longer than I want to admit. I could not cross the ward stones from outside without the Alpha's permission. Attempting it without permission, going back in without being called, would read as a challenge to the pack structure. And Kelric would have every legal right within pack law to respond accordingly. I would lose whatever chance remained to fix this. I needed him to come to me, but I was not going to sit in a cave and wait for a proud man to exhaust his pride while people died. I went to the cave entrance and knelt on the cold stone and placed both palms flat on the ground and closed my eyes. The pendant pulsed warm against my chest. The frequency was still there, diminished, cut off from the ward stones, but still oscillating inside the silver, the way a heartbeat continues inside a body, even when the body has been separated from everything that gives it context. I gathered the passive pulse into something I had never tried before. Not a read, not the receptive openness I had practiced my entire life. Something directional, something that pushed rather than received. I fed it through the pendant, through the contact point of my palms on the stone, and I sent it north, through the frozen earth, through the ridge, through the dead ward stones and the 3 miles of frost thickened air between me and the fortress. A signal. Faint, fragile. The equivalent of a voice calling across a distance too great for the volume it was using, but specific. Tuned to the one frequency that would cut through the noise of Kelrick's vigilance heat if he was willing to stop broadcasting long enough to listen. You are running out of time, Kelrick. Stop being proud and come find me. The stone under my hands was cold and silent. The signal went out and I had no way of knowing if it arrived. No way of knowing if he felt it. No way of knowing if a man who had spent 20 years solving every problem by confronting it head-on was capable of doing the one thing that would save his pack, which was to stop confronting and start listening. I stayed there with my hands on the frozen ground for a long time. Then I got up and went back to the fire and sat with my back against the stone and waited for morning. The second night was worse than the first because I knew what was happening and I could feel it and I could not stop it. The passive pulse delivered every death to me with the precision of a courier who does not understand the contents of the message but delivers it on time, regardless. 2 more sentries. An elder in the East Wing whose warmth had been fading for days, and who finally slipped below the threshold sometime past midnight. A child. I felt the child go, and I put my hand over my mouth and breathed through my fingers and did not make a sound. There is a specific quality to the absence left by a small life. It is not larger than the absence of an adult. It is not louder. It is a particular frequency of loss that resonates at a pitch the passive pulse was never meant to receive, and when it arrives, it does not fit anywhere. It just sits in your chest alongside everything else and refuses to be filed or categorized or made sense of. I did not sleep after that. In the morning, I went back to the ridge. The ward stones were not just dark. They were cracked. I saw it from the riverbank before I had even climbed to the high ground. The way you see structural damage in stone from a distance before you can identify the specific point of failure. The granite faces of 4 of the 7 boulders had split. Not weathering. Not frost heave. Explosive cracking. The kind that happens when a structure has been under sustained compression and the material finally gives. The boundary was not just inactive, it was physically destroyed. There was no ward to restore. Even if I crossed, even if Kelrick permitted it, the stones themselves would have to be rebuilt. A process that would take weeks and specific materials and knowledge held in Osric's archive and the cooperation of the Alpha and the Anchor working together. None of which could happen while I was out here, and he was in there. He needed to come today. Back at the river, the ice had changed overnight. The surface had developed a pattern, fine lines running through the black glass, not cracks, something more deliberate. The way frost forms on a window in cold weather, but organized, directional, spreading outward from a central point in the middle of the river. The lines branched and rebranched like a circulatory system, like the river was developing a nervous system made of cold, and the center of it pulsed with the same slow rhythm I had felt through my palms the day before. I knelt and put my hands on it again. The heartbeat was stronger. Whatever was beneath the ice had grown more confident overnight. The pressure of it had increased the way a sound increases when the source moves closer, and the direction of it had clarified. Not somewhere beneath the river, not somewhere in the earth below me. North, back through the ridge, back through what used to be the Wardstone's boundary. back inside the territory, back toward the fortress, back toward Kael'ric. The living freeze does not just seek warmth. I had understood that much from the river's behavior. Ordinary cold seeks warmth, fills spaces of lower temperature, the basic physics of heat exchange. This was something else. It was selective. It was not spreading evenly outward from the broken boundary in all directions. It was moving with intention, following a specific signal, drawn to a specific source. In werewolf biology, the alpha's heat is structural, not just metabolic. Every pack wolf runs warm. The inner wolf maintains a core temperature that keeps us functional in conditions that would incapacitate an ordinary person. But the alpha's heat is different in kind, not just degree. It is what the old records call the vigilance heat. Not just warmth, but authority made physical. The metabolic expression of pack leadership. A constant broadcast that says I am the apex point of this structure, and everything connects through me. In a healthy pack, balanced between the apex authority and the grounding awareness of every omega who holds the bottom of the structure steady, that broadcast is part of what keeps the territory stable. The vigilance heat and the passive pulse in counterweight. Leadership and awareness running simultaneously, neither one overwhelming the other. But Kael'ric had been running his vigilance heat without a counterweight for 3 days now. Every decision made without consultation. Every resource allocation directed by a single point of authority. Every instinct to fight the encroaching cold with more dominance rather than less. All of it feeding that broadcast, making it louder, more concentrated, more irresistible to something that had been waiting outside the boundary for exactly this kind of signal. Inside those walls, I knew what was happening without seeing it. Kael'ric was issuing commands, sending warriors to hack at ice with iron weapons. Voss was at his shoulder counseling more discipline, more control, more force, and every swing of every blade was a transfer of energy. Every command was fuel. The frost was not attacking the pack. It was answering the alpha. I went back to the cave and sat with that understanding for the better part of the morning. The fire had burned down to coals, and I did not rebuild it. Not because I was not cold, but because I needed to think without distraction and discomfort is a good focuser of attention. If the frost was feeding on Kael'ric's vigilance heat, intensifying every time he tried to exert authority over it, growing every time he responded to it with dominance rather than yielding, then sending warriors to fight, it was the worst possible response. He was pouring oil on a fire and reading the increased intensity as proof that he needed to pour more, and he would keep doing it until someone told him otherwise, or until there was no one left to tell. I pressed my fist against the cave floor and felt the drain working underneath me, patient as stone. He needs to hear this from me, not from Osric reading it out of an archive record, not from a scout reporting back about ice patterns in the courtyard, from me, directly. In terms specific enough that a man who has spent his entire life solving problems by confronting them head-on can understand why that strategy will kill him this time. The second set of prints appeared at the ridge that afternoon. Different boots. I went up to check when I felt the movement through the ground. But it was Tormund, not Kael'ric, standing at the boundary line with 2 warriors behind him, looking out across the southern side with the focused, squinting expression of a man trying to see something at a distance. He looked bad. The kind of bad that comes from 3 nights of insufficient sleep in deteriorating conditions. Tight around the eyes. Jaw set with the effort of maintaining normal expression. His armor was rimed with frost. When he exhaled, his breath hung in the air longer than it should have in ordinary cold. The moisture crystallizing before it dispersed. He looked out in my direction for a long time. I was in the tree line, maybe 40 yards from the ridge, close enough to see his face clearly, close enough to see the thing that was happening behind his eyes, which was the slow, grinding reassessment of a man who is beginning to suspect that the person he dismissed might have been the only person telling the truth. He said something to the warrior on his right, too low for me to catch. Then he turned around and went back. The third morning, the ward stones cracked and gone. The river pulsing with a heartbeat that was not its own. The temperature dropping in a way that had stopped feeling like weather and had started feeling like intent. I went back to the river and sat on the bank with my hands in my lap and my mother's pendant warm against my chest. And I waited. I put the passive pulse out in every direction and I held it there. A sustained read of the territory state, feeling the frosts advance inside the walls with a clarity that got sharper the worse the damage became. The absences were multiplying, not quickly. The frost was thorough, but it was not frantic. It was working with the patience of something that understood it had already won and was simply completing the process. 2 hours past midday. I felt him cross the ridge. Not heard. Felt. The way you feel a change in air pressure when a door opens in another room. The atmosphere adjusting. The passive pulse registering the specific displaced weight of an alpha moving through territory in a way that had nothing to do with how loud his footsteps were. He was moving fast and moving alone. And his vigilance heat was running so hot I could feel it from a quarter mile out. The aggressive metabolic broadcast of a man under sustained threat who has spent 3 days trying to fight his way through something that got bigger every time he swung. I kept my hands in my lap and my eyes on the river and waited for his boots to crunch to a stop behind me. They did. Silence. "You broke the seal," I said. A long pause. The wind moved through the dead pines above us. Somewhere on the river, the ice shifted with a sound like something settling deeper into sleep. "I know," he said. Just that. No qualification following it. No pivot into explanation or context or the reasonable chain of decisions that had led him here. 2 words sitting by themselves in the frozen air between us. And in their plainness, they told me more about the state of Kelric Ashen than anything I had seen from him in 23 years of living in his pack. I pulled my hands off the ice and stood up and turned around. He looked terrible, and he looked honest, which was more than I had expected from him 3 days ago, and exactly what I needed from him right now. His iron crown was gone. His armor was rimed solid at every joint, the metal coated in a layer of frost so uniform it looked intentional, like someone had dipped him in white and pulled him out before it fully dried. The repaired crack on the left pauldron was visible now as a dark line through the white, the one imperfection the frost had not managed to cover. He was alone, no escort, no counsel, no senior warriors flanking him the way they always flanked him in any situation that might require a show of authority. Just a man standing in dead trees, with his hands open at his sides and snow falling on him that he had not brushed off. His scent reached me before I was ready for it. Cedar smoke and heated iron, the same as it had been in his solar 3 nights ago. But underneath it now, there was something else, something I had not smelled on him before. The sharp, burnt edge that the body produces when it has been running at full capacity for too long without rest. The scent of a man whose own heat was consuming him from the inside because he had nowhere to direct it and no one to help him carry it. "Tell me what Osric told you," I said. He told me all of it. The archive records, the 100-year cycle, the living freeze and what it fed on, and what the anchor was, and what the ward stones actually did, versus what the pack had always believed they did. He was methodical about it, delivering information in the flat, sequenced way he delivered everything. But underneath the delivery, I could hear what it had cost him to go to Osric at all. A man who has spent 20 years being the one who knows things, sitting across from an old archivist and asking him to explain the basic mechanics of his own territory. When he finished, I said, "How much of that had you worked out before Osric told you?" A pause. The frost following me. I had worked that out. Took me until the second day, but I worked it out. He exhaled, and the breath hung between us like something solid, and I tried commanding it to stop anyway. He said it without expression. It got worse. I looked at him. "Yes," I said. "It would." He was quiet for a long moment. The dead pines creaked above us. The frost on the trees nearby had grown overnight into long, fine needles, and every single one of them was pointing inward toward him, the way compass needles point toward magnetic north. His body was a beacon, and everything cold and old and hungry in this territory was oriented around the signal of it. "Calric," I said, "look at the trees." He looked. I watched him see it, the needles all pointing toward him, the frost orienting itself around the signal of his vigilance heat, demonstrating in the most literal possible terms the mechanism I had just described. The visible proof of the thing he had been refusing to believe. He looked at it for a long time. His jaw worked once, the way it does when a man is swallowing something that does not go down easily. Then he looked back at me. "How do we fix it together?" I said, and I mean that literally. Not as a figure of speech, not as a general statement about cooperation. Physically together. Hands in contact with the ground, your frequency and mine running through the same point simultaneously, the alpha's heat and the anchor's signal working as a single input. I watched his face. "I need you to understand what that requires from you before we go back inside. Tell me." "It requires you to stop leading." I let the words sit. "For the duration of the contact, not permanently. Not as an abdication. Just in that moment, you stop being the apex point of the structure and you become the power source. You provide the energy and I provide the direction. The frost is feeding on your authority. The only way to stop feeding it is to temporarily stop being what it is hungry for." Something moved through his expression. Not resistance exactly. Something deeper than resistance. The involuntary flinch of a man being asked to set down the thing he has been holding for so long that his hands have forgotten any other shape. 20 years of leadership. 20 years of being the single point through which every decision and every crisis and every loss in this pack had been processed. He was not holding power because he wanted it. He was holding it because he had forgotten how to put it down without feeling like the ground would disappear beneath him. I stepped closer, close enough that the warmth radiating off him reached me through the frozen air between us, close enough that his scent wrapped around me fully, and I had to make a conscious effort not to close my eyes against the unexpected comfort of it. Cedar smoke and heated iron, and underneath it the raw exhaustion of a man who had been burning alone for too long. "I have watched you lead this pack for 23 years, I said. My voice was quieter now. Not because I was uncertain, but because some things are better said at a volume that requires the other person to lean in. I watched you hold it together through the border war, through the famine, through every crisis that should have broken you and did not. You are the strongest alpha I have ever known. And right now, the strongest thing you can do is trust someone else to carry the weight for 10 minutes. He looked at me, and for a moment, the man behind the alpha was visible in a way I had never seen. Not the king, not the commander, not the broad-shouldered silhouette on the rampart wall. A man my age who was tired in a way that sleep would not fix, who had spent 3 days watching his people die and fighting the thing that was killing them and making it worse with every breath, and who was standing in front of the one person who could help him and trying to find the courage to let her. "All right," he said quietly. "Tell me what to do. Walk behind me. My trail is the only one the frost will not close. Stay within arm's reach and do not issue any commands when we go back through the gate, regardless of what you see." I picked up my pack from the bank and Kelrick. When we get inside, what comes after is a conversation we are going to have in front of your pack. Not a private negotiation. Public. Everything that changes where they can see it. He did not flinch from that. Understood. I started walking north. He fell in behind me without argument. We were halfway up the ridge when the fortress gate came into view, and standing in front of it were 6 figures in armor, Voss in the center. His sword was not drawn, but his hand was on the hilt, and his posture carried the specific rigidity of a man who has decided something and is prepared to enforce it. I stopped. Kelrick stopped behind me. "My king." Voss's voice carried down the slope, clear and controlled and absolutely certain. "You cannot enter this fortress behind an exiled Omega. The pack cannot see this. The structure cannot survive this." I felt Kelrick's vigilance heat spike behind me. The reflex, the biological imperative of an alpha being challenged at his own gate. His body wanted to step forward, to command, to assert. I felt the frost on the ridge respond immediately, leaning toward him, the fine needles on the nearest dead pine swiveling in his direction like a field of flowers turning toward the sun. I reached back without looking and placed my hand against his forearm. The contact was brief, just enough to interrupt the reflex before it completed. His heat was enormous under my palm, the skin beneath his armor burning with the sustained output of 3 days of unbroken vigilance. "Do not," I said, low enough that only he could hear. "Not now." He held. I felt the effort of it in the tremor that ran through the muscle under my fingers, but he held. I took my hand back and walked toward Voss. He watched me come. His face showed nothing. His eyes showed everything. The absolute conviction of a man defending the only world he understood against the only threat he could not categorize. He was not evil. He was not cruel. He was a man whose entire identity was built on the certainty that the hierarchy was sacred and inviolable, and that any deviation from it was the first step toward collapse. And he was looking at that collapse, walking toward him in the shape of a woman who should not have had the authority to walk anywhere at all. "Look at the walls, Voss," I said. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The walls spoke for themselves. The frost on the gatehouse stones had been growing since we started up the ridge. I could see it from here. The fine directional lines spreading outward from the point where Voss's soldiers stood, their iron weapons radiating the cold they were supposed to be fighting. Every blade they carried was a conduit. Every command Voss had given in the last 3 days was fuel. "Look at how far it has spread since you started giving orders," I said. "Look at the frost on the walls directly behind you, and tell me if it was there this morning." Voss did not look, not immediately. His hand tightened on his sword hilt. Every command you issue, every time you assert authority, every time any of you swing a blade at this frost, you are feeding it. I stopped 10 feet from him. You are not fighting an enemy, Voss. You are ringing a dinner bell. He looked. I watched his eyes move to the wall behind him. I watched him see the frost veins that had spread 3 feet in the time he had been standing there. I watched the calculation happen behind his face, the military mind that had kept him alive through the border war processing new information against a framework that had no category for it. He looked back at me. He looked past me at Kelrick standing behind me on the slope. He looked at the frost on the walls one more time. Then he took his hand off his sword, and he stepped aside. The warriors behind him parted without being told. Voss stood to the left of the open gate with his arms at his sides and his jaw set and his eyes on the ground. And he said nothing as I walked past him, and he said nothing as Kelrick walked past him, and the silence he kept was the loudest thing about him. The gate was open. Beyond it, the courtyard waited. And what waited inside it was worse than anything I had prepared myself for. I had prepared myself for damage. I had been feeling the frosts advance from 3 miles away for 3 days, tracking every death and every temperature drop through the passive pulse with a clarity that sharpened as the situation deteriorated. I had built a picture of it in my mind. I thought I was ready. I was not ready. The courtyard looked like the inside of something that had been frozen mid-breath. Ice columns rising from the ground in irregular clusters, thick as tree trunks, translucent and blue-white, and laced through with those fine directional lines I had seen developing in the river surface. They grew at angles that should not have been structurally possible, leaning and branching and connecting to each other in arches that turned the open courtyard into something closer to the ribcage of an enormous animal made entirely of cold. The stone walls had grown a skin of crystal that caught the gray afternoon light and refracted it in directions that made the geometry of the space feel wrong, distorted, like looking at a familiar room through water. Doorways had narrowed under the accumulation. Windows had sealed themselves shut behind layers of frost so thick the glass was no longer visible. One of the fire pits had frozen solid, not the wood and ash of a dead fire, but a full column of ice rising from the pit's base to 3 feet above its rim, and inside it, preserved in the crystal with a clarity that made my stomach turn, was the ghost shape of flames. Every tongue of fire rendered in ice, every curl of heat frozen in place, as if the cold had arrived mid-burn and locked everything where it was. The frost had not just killed the fire. It had made a trophy of the killing. Warriors moved through all of it, maybe 40 of them, hacking at ice columns with axes and maces and the worn-out determination of people who have been fighting a losing battle long enough to stop believing they can win but have not yet stopped fighting. Their armor was rimed white, their breath crystallized before it left their mouths. Several were moving with the stiff, careful gait of people whose joints had begun to freeze inside their boots. I could feel them through the passive pulse, not healthy warmth. The diminished, flickering heat of bodies running at maximum for 3 days and beginning to fail. Candles burning down to the last inch of wick. Tormund was the first to see us. He was at the far end of the courtyard, working at a frost vein that had grown across the entrance to the main stores. His mace rising and falling with a rhythm that had gone beyond purposeful into something closer to compulsive. The frost vein he was striking had grown 4 inches wider since I entered the courtyard. Each impact of his mace was feeding it, Every transfer of kinetic energy through the iron head was being absorbed and converted into more of itself. He stopped mid-swing, stared. His eyes went from me to the man standing half a step behind me and back. I watched his face cycle through surprise, confusion, the beginning of an objection that died between his throat and his teeth. Then something more complex as he processed the specific image. The Alpha King standing behind an exiled Omega. Not beside, not leading, behind. In the position that pack structure reserves for the one who follows. The word spread the way awareness always spreads through a pack. Not through speech, but through the sudden collective reorientation of attention. Heads turning, movement stopping. Within 30 seconds, every warrior in the courtyard was still and looking at us. And the silence was the loudest thing I had heard in 3 days. I did not let it sit. Put the weapons down. I said it clearly, projecting without shouting. Every blade, every mace, set them on the ground. Tormund's jaw tightened. The mace was still raised. You are feeding it, I said. I walked forward into the courtyard, moving toward the largest concentration of frost veins, feeling the living freeze's attention shift as I moved. The way its pressure tracked toward me rather than toward Kelric now that I was between them. I was a buffer, a redirect. The way a lightning rod does not prevent lightning but gives it a path that does not go through the house. Iron is a product of the earth. Hitting the frost with iron does not weaken it. It gives it more surface area to work with. Every impact is a transfer of energy. You have been making it stronger since the first blade touched it. Look at the vein you were working on, Tormund. I said it without turning around. Look at how far it has spread since you started. A long pause. The silence of a man seeing something for the first time that he has been staring at for 3 days. Put them down, Kelric said. His voice was quiet. No command weight behind it. No authority broadcast. He was keeping himself tamped down the way I had asked, and it was costing him. I could feel the effort in the slight roughness of his voice. Every cell in his body screaming at him to assert, to command, to be the apex point, and he was refusing to do it, holding all of that heat inside himself and letting it burn rather than broadcasting it into a courtyard full of frost that would have absorbed every watt and asked for more. Just those 3 words at conversation volume. A request from a man who had spent 20 years issuing commands. The weapons went down, one by one in a slow cascade, metal on wet stone. Tormund was last. He held the mace for 5 seconds longer than anyone else. Then he looked at the frost vein one more time, measured its edge against the mark where it had been when he started, saw the difference, and set the mace on the ground with the precise motion of a man who fully intends to pick it back up if the next 60 seconds do not go the way they have been promised. The frost in the center of the courtyard had been building since we walked through the gate. I had felt it gathering the way you feel a storm front building. Pressure changes, the air taking on a charge. The specific quality of imminence that precedes something about to resolve itself into a form that would make everything before it feel like prelude. Stay back, I said to the warriors. Stay back and stay still. Whatever happens in the next few minutes, stay still. Do not swing. Do not shout. Do not assert anything. I walked to the center. The ice fog churned, actively rotating around a central axis, thickening and darkening as the frost poured more of itself into the forming shape above the frozen fire pit, drawing substance from the ice columns and the crystal walls and the frost veins, pulling itself together from every corner of the courtyard into a single concentrated presence. I could feel the weight of the thing assembling itself above me. It was enormous, not in a way you could measure. It did not have edges that stayed still long enough to define, a shape that kept resolving and dissolving, the suggestion of something very large and very old. Deep chest, heavy head, the outline of something that moved like a wolf, but occupied the space of something the size of a house, made of compressed darkness and crystal and the memory of cold that had been accumulating for 100 years, waiting for this exact opening. It looked at Kaelric. I felt him react from 10 feet behind me. The vigilance surge, the biological reflex every alpha carries. His core temperature spiked. His vigilance heat flared outward like a furnace door thrown open. He fought it back down. Faster than I expected, but not before the frost had registered it. The shape lurched forward. One moment it was above the fire pit. The next it was between me and Kaelric, close enough that the cold radiating off it hit my face like walking into a frozen wall. So cold my lungs seized and the moisture on my eyelashes crystallized. Kaelric. I kept my voice flat and even. The steadiness was not performance. It was the passive pulse doing what it had always done, holding the frequency steady when everything around it was destabilizing. Look at me. He looked at me, amber eyes through frost haze, and in them I saw the thing he was fighting, which was not fear. Fear he could have handled. What I saw was the realization that the strength he had built his entire identity around was the weapon being used against him. That every instinct telling him to fight was the instinct that would kill them all. Step beside me, right now, same level. Do not think about it. He stepped. His shoulder came level with mine, close enough that the heat radiating off him reached me through the frozen air, close enough that his scent cut through the cold. Cedar smoke and heated iron, and underneath it, something I had never smelled on him before. Something that smelled like the moment before a man lets go of something he has been holding for 20 years. I heard the warriors react, a collective intake of breath, the sound of people watching the most permanent feature of their world rearrange itself. The Alpha King standing level with an Omega, the hierarchy that every wolf had been born into, visibly reorganized in the space of a single step. The shape in the fog slowed. Here is what the living freeze cannot process: balance. It is a feedback mechanism for a specific imbalance, the unchecked accumulation of authority without awareness, dominance without counterweight. It has spent 100 years calibrating to feed on exactly that signal. When Kaelric had been broadcasting alone, the frost had a clear target, a defined meal. But Kaelric standing level with an anchor, the apex authority and the grounding awareness at the same frequency simultaneously, produced a signal the frost had no category for, like showing a predator something that does not fit its hunting template, not prey, not threat, something outside the framework entirely. It did not retreat. It hesitated. That was enough. The ground, I said. Now. I knelt on the courtyard stone. The cold came through my knees immediately. That hollow, specific cold of the drain working upward from below. I pressed my left palm flat against the surface. The frost veins pulsed with the same rhythm as the river ice, the same slow, deep breathing patience I had been listening to for 3 days. Kaelric knelt beside me without hesitation. He placed his hand over mine. The contact was immediate and strange. Not the warmth I had expected, but something more complex. 2 different frequencies meeting at a single point and discovering each other. His was broad and hot and radiating outward in all directions, the way a furnace radiates, raw and undirected. Mine was narrow and specific and oscillating at the wardstone's frequency, the signal my mother had calibrated into the pendant and that I had been broadcasting my whole life without understanding what I was broadcasting. Together, they were something neither one was separately. And in the moment of contact, something happened that I had not anticipated. The frequencies did not just combine. They communicated. His heat flowing into me and mine flowing into him, and in the exchange, a window opening between us that neither of us had known existed. I felt him, not his thoughts. The texture of what it felt like to be Kaelric Ashen. 20 years of carrying 300 lives. The border war not as history but as a wound that never closed. 60 names he still knew. 60 faces he saw when he closed his eyes. The specific way his hands shook late at night when the fortress was quiet, and there was nothing left to hold. The loneliness of a man surrounded by 300 people who look to him for everything and see him as nothing but the function he performs. 20 years of being the wall, never once asked how the wall was holding. And he felt me. I knew it because his hand tightened over mine and his breath caught in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. 23 years of standing at the edges, pressing palms against walls and reading frequencies no one else could hear, being told that knowing things was not my place. The night I sat with Brielle's son and felt his fever break and carried the warmth of her gratitude back to an empty room. The years of being invisible, not because I was hidden, because no one thought to look. We saw each other, truly and completely, and for the first time, not the Omega and the King. Two people who had been carrying different halves of the same weight in adjacent rooms of the same house for 23 years and had never opened the door between them. It lasted less than a heartbeat, and it changed everything. I stopped fighting the cold. I had been bracing against it for 3 days. I let that go, let the cold come in. Let it find the contact point and come through me rather than at me. I was a bridge, not a wall. The raw heat of Kaelric's authority flowing into me, and the passive pulse translating it, directing it, grounding it down through the stone and into the earth and into the frequency of the broken ward stones, feeding the boundary filter from the inside. The combined signal of Alpha and Anchor working together for the first time in the living memory of this pack. The ground hummed. The sound was inside my bones before it was in the air. A vibration that started at the contact point and moved outward through the stone and waves, traveling along the frost veins the way a signal travels along a wire, not fighting the frost's infrastructure but using it. Turning the channels it had built into conduits for the very frequency that would undo it. A hairline fracture appeared beneath my thumb, then another, then the sound of glass. Thousands of small breakages happening in sequence, a cascade traveling outward across the courtyard in every direction. The frost veins cracking at their joints and turning to fine powder. The ice columns fracturing from the base upward in long spiraling splits. The crystal skin on the walls shattering into dust that was drawn back toward the southern boundary as if by a pressure difference. A wind at ground level, pulling the frost back the way the tide pulls water from a shore. Not violent, methodical. The reversal of a process that had been advancing for 3 days undone in 3 minutes with the same patience with which it had been built. Like watching destruction played backward, the courtyard emerging from beneath the ice like a face emerging from beneath a mask. The shape in the fog gave one sound, a single crack, dry and final, like the deepest part of a frozen river giving way in the first thaw. Not a cry of pain, a settling, the sound of something very old being allowed to return to the state it had existed in before the broken ward stones gave it a door, and the Alpha's unbalanced heat gave it a reason to walk through. Then it dissolved, simply lost coherence. The form that had been assembling for 100 years came apart the way fog comes apart when the temperature changes, quietly and completely, and without leaving evidence that it had ever been solid. The pressure lifted. I stayed on my knees for a moment, breathing. The courtyard was wet now, stone slick with rapid melt, water running in thin sheets toward the drains, steam rising from surfaces frozen for 3 days. The frozen fire pit cracked open as the ice column gave way, and underneath it the charred wood and ash of the original fire, still there, waiting to be relit. The air was cold, but it was honest cold, winter cold, the cold of a season going about its business, rather than the cold of something with intent. My palm was raw where it had been pressed against the stone. The pendant against my chest had gone from burning hot to warmly steady, the oscillation returning to its normal frequency. The boundary signal restored. Kelrick's hand was still over mine on the wet granite. "The ridge," he said. His voice was rough, stripped down to something I had not heard in it before. Not the resonance of a man built around the expectation of being heard. Something quieter, something that sounded like it was being used for the first time. I can feel the ward stones. They are running. I pulled my hand back slowly, feeling the separation of his frequency from mine, like the separation of two sounds that have been harmonizing. "The physical damage still needs repair," I said, "but the frequency is there. The filter is back up." Around us, the courtyard was completely silent. Every warrior standing in a ring around the fire pit, weapons on the ground, wet stone shining in the gray afternoon light, and on their faces an expression I had never seen on ashen warriors before. Not the blind following expression, not the performance of loyalty. Something more awake than that. Something with a question in it that none of them had words for yet, but all of them could feel. The expression of people who have just watched the fundamental assumption of their world turn out to be incomplete. I stood up. My legs ached and my knees had gone fully numb, and I straightened slowly. Kelrick stood beside me. Not behind, not in front. Beside. Neither of us moved to change that. He looked at his pack. They looked at him. "Get warm," I said to the courtyard. Real fires, oak base, water from the interior systems until someone has checked the outer wells. Anyone showing signs of deep cold, the kind that does not respond to heat within an hour, comes to me directly. I looked at Halric, standing nearest with his arms crossed and his expression carefully neutral. The boundary stones on the southern ridge need a physical assessment before the next weather front. I will need 3 people who know the ridge. Halric nodded once, started moving, no hesitation. Voss was standing inside the gate, his sword on the ground where he had left it on the ridge. He had not picked it up. He stood with his arms at his sides and his face showing the particular blankness of a man whose certainty has been removed so completely that he has not yet developed a replacement expression. I walked to him, not with anger, not with the satisfaction of vindication, though I would be lying if I said the temptation was not there. I walked to him because what came next needed to be established clearly and publicly. "You are relieved of advisory duties," I said, "effective now." His eyes met mine. There was nothing in them I could use, no defiance, no remorse, just the flat emptiness of a man standing in the ruins of his own conviction. Your new assignment is boundary stone reconstruction under my direct supervision. You will carry stone. You will mix compound. You will do the physical work of rebuilding the thing your counsel helped destroy. I held his gaze. This is not punishment, Voss. This is education. You spent 3 days advising the Alpha to fight harder against something that fed on fighting. Every order you counseled, every command you encouraged, every time you told him to assert more authority and swing more iron, you were feeding the thing that killed 12 of our people, not out of malice, out of certainty. The certainty that the hierarchy you believed in was the only structure that could protect this pack. You were wrong. The hierarchy was incomplete. And your certainty in an incomplete structure cost lives. You will spend the next 11 days learning what the boundary actually requires, learning the relationship between the alpha's heat and the anchor's frequency. And when we are finished, you will have something better than certainty. You will have knowledge. And knowledge, unlike certainty, can change when the evidence changes. He said nothing, but he did not look away. And somewhere behind the blankness, something moved. Not understanding. Not yet. A crack in the surface. The willingness to consider the possibility that the crack might let something in. Good. Report to the southern ridge at first light. I turned back toward the courtyard. The sound of boots on wet stone had returned. Voices, not loud. Something quieter and more careful. The sound of people who have survived something and are beginning to move again. Someone had gotten a fire started in the nearest pit. Real fire. The orange light catching in the wet stone, and the first small circle of warmth spreading outward like a heartbeat, resuming. Kelrick had not moved. He was standing where I had left him, looking at the wet stone where our hands had been, steam still rising from the spot. Tomorrow, I said to him quietly, in front of the pack, all of it. What happened, what changes, what the new structure is. Not tonight. Tonight you need to eat something and sleep. And so do I. I looked at him sideways. But tomorrow it is all public. He nodded. He looked very tired. He looked for the first time since I had known him like a man his own age. Not the king, not the commander. Just a man in his early 40s, standing in a wet courtyard with frost melting off his armor, and something new in his face that had not been there 3 days ago. Something that might have been the beginning of relief. Something that might have been the beginning of trust. Something that might have been the beginning of something else entirely. Something that neither of us had a name for yet, and that both of us had felt in the moment our hands touched the stone and the door between 23 years of adjacent loneliness opened for the first time. Revna, he said. I waited. You came back. I looked at him. The amber eyes, the frost caught in his beard, the crack in the pauldron the armorer had filled but not quite matched. The hands that had held mine on frozen stone and had trembled with the effort of not commanding and had held steady anyway. You came to get me, I said. That is what made it possible. I left him standing in the wet courtyard and went to find something to eat. I did not sleep well. I had expected to. 3 days outside in deteriorating cold. 3 nights in a shallow cave on a hard floor. I had expected to collapse into something long and deep and restorative. Instead, I lay on my cot in the small room I had occupied since childhood and stared at the ceiling and listened to the fortress settle. The drip of meltwater running off the roof. Footsteps as the night watch changed. Somewhere below, someone had gotten a hearth fire burning properly, and the smell of real wood smoke reached my floor, and I lay there breathing it like a person who had forgotten what ordinary comfort smelled like. I was home, and 12 people were dead, and the ward stones were cracked, and the boundary filter was running at reduced power. And tomorrow I had to stand in front of 300 wolves and help reshape the world they lived in. And somewhere in this fortress, in a room I had never entered but could feel through the pack bond like a warm stone in a cold river, Calric Ashen was not sleeping either. His vigilance heat running at a low, steady level, the metabolic signature of a man lying awake in a dark room, thinking, not about the crisis that had passed, but about the thing that had replaced it. Somewhere past the second hour I accepted that sleep was not coming, and got up. The courtyard was empty at this hour, still wet, stones shining under a half moon that had found a gap in the cloud cover. The ice columns were gone. The crystal skin was gone. What remained was the ordinary winter courtyard I had grown up in, scoured clean, looking both damaged and simplified at once. I walked to the center and crouched and pressed my palm against the ground. The drain was gone. In its place was the normal thermal exchange of stone and night air. Nothing pulling from below. Nothing patient underneath waiting for a weakness in the seal. Just earth. I held my hand there for a long moment, running the passive pulse down as far as it would reach, checking for any residual current, any trace of that slow, deep breathing patience. Nothing. Just earth. Just the ground of a territory that was, for the first time in perhaps a century, truly held by both halves of the structure that was supposed to hold it. I stayed crouched there in the dark for a while, my hand on the wet stone, and felt the pack bond settle around me the way a blanket settles when you pull it up. Not all at once, gradually finding its shape, its familiar weight returning to my chest by increments, damaged in places, thin where it had been torn by the deaths, but present, running, the low background hum of belonging that I had not known I was carrying until it was gone, and had not known I had missed until it came back. 300 lives minus 12, connected, most of them sleeping, all of them still here. I went back inside and made myself lie down, and this time I slept. Calric called the assembly at dawn, not mid-morning, not at the more dignified hour that council assemblies were traditionally held, dawn, when the light was still gray and uncertain, and the pack was pulling on boots and wrapping furs around their shoulders and moving through the courtyard with the blinking, slightly fragile air of people who had survived something and were not yet sure what it meant that they had. He had sent word to every building in the fortress compound the previous evening, no exceptions, everyone present. They gathered in the main courtyard, all of them. Warriors and hunters and craftspeople and children held at their parents' sides. Elders who had to be helped down icy steps and who stood in the back with the particular stillness of people who have seen enough history to know when they are inside a piece of it. The courtyard had not held the full pack in years. There was barely room to stand without touching the person beside you. Breath rising in white clouds from 300 mouths, the collective warmth of it making the air noticeably different from the air 20 feet above their heads. I stood at the back. I had positioned myself deliberately at the edge of the crowd, not at the front, not beside the steps where Calric's council usually flanked him. I wanted to be visible, but not prominent. What was about to happen needed to happen on its own terms. Calric came out of the great hall alone. No council, no escort, no senior warriors forming the usual frame of authority around him. Just the man in his armor, with the repaired pauldron and his iron crown sitting slightly crooked on his forehead, the way it had been since he retrieved it from the throne room floor. He stopped at the top of the steps and looked out at his pack, and nobody spoke. "I am not going to make a speech about resilience," he said. His voice carried in the cold air without effort. That had always been one of his particular qualities. Not loudness, but resonance. The voice of a man whose chest had been built around the expectation of being heard. "I am not going to talk about the gods or fate or difficult seasons. Those are things you say when what happened was beyond your control." He paused. "What happened here was not beyond my control." The courtyard was so still I could hear the melt water dripping from the eaves. I made choices. Specific choices in sequence that resulted in 12 of our people dead and this fortress nearly consumed. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform the admission. He delivered it the way he delivered everything, with the flat directness of a man who had decided that economy of language was more honest than decoration. 3 weeks ago, Revna Quiet Dusk came to me with a warning. She had been tracking signs for 2 weeks. The elk migration, the birds, the northern den. She came to me and told me what she had found and what she believed it meant. He found me at the back of the crowd. Our eyes met for a moment. He looked back out at the assembly. I dismissed her publicly. Then I warned her privately not to speak of it further. When she did anyway, because the warning was real and she knew it was real, I exiled her beyond the southern ridge. A pause, long enough to let the courtyard absorb it. I told myself I was protecting the pack's morale. What I was actually protecting was my certainty. I had already told you this winter would not touch us. Admitting I was wrong would have cost me something, and I chose not to pay that cost. Something moved through the crowd. Not a sound exactly. A shift. A collective adjustment. Like a large organism changing its posture. 12 people are dead because of that choice. The boundary stones are cracked and need rebuilding. The pack bond is damaged and needs time. He stopped. Let all of that sit in the cold air without trying to soften it or frame it or move past it toward the redemptive part. Just the facts. Just the cost. Sitting where everyone could see them. I am telling you this not because I expect forgiveness. I am telling you because the structure that allowed it to happen has to change. And you need to understand why the change is real and not cosmetic. He reached inside his cloak. The iron crown came out in his hands. He held it for a moment. Not dramatically. Not with the ceremony of a man making a point. The way you hold something you have been carrying too long and have finally decided to put down. Then he came down the steps slowly, and the crowd opened before him the way crowds always open for Kelric, that automatic parting, and he walked through it toward the back, toward me. I watched him come. I did not move. The people on either side of me stepped back without being asked, leaving a corridor of space between us. I stood in the center of it with my arms at my sides and waited. He stopped in front of me. He went to one knee and placed the iron crown on the wet stone at my feet. The gasps were real and unscripted and immediate, a sound that rippled back through the crowd from the point of impact the way a stone ripples water. Someone said something behind me in a low voice that I did not catch. A child near the front asked its parent a question, and the parent did not answer. I looked at the crown on the ground between us, dented at one point on the left side where it had hit the throne room floor, darker at the metal joints. The iron of it looked ordinary in the morning light, not symbolic, not powerful, just metal that had been shaped and worn and repaired and worn some more. The history of it visible in every imperfection. I crouched down and picked it up, held it for a moment, felt the weight of it properly for the first time. Heavier than I had expected. Heavier than it looked from a distance. The kind of heavy that settles into you rather than just sitting on top. I stepped forward and placed it back on his head. "Stand up," I said. He stood. "You are still Alpha." I said it clearly. This was not a private conversation. Every word was for the 300 people standing in this courtyard. That does not change. What changes is what that means going forward. The pack needs walls, and it needs someone willing to make hard decisions in a crisis. That is you. It has always been you, and that does not stop today. I held his gaze. What also does not stop is this. The next time someone in this pack brings you a warning, not just me, anyone, you examine it. You do not manage it. You do not contain it. You do not weigh it against your public position and decide it is too inconvenient to be true. You examine it. If it is wrong, say why. If it is right, act. That is the agreement. That is the agreement, he said. And it is not just between us. I turned to the courtyard. The structure that let this happen was not one man's pride. It was a structure that told every Omega in this pack that their observations were not worth the cost of saying out loud. That told every wolf at the bottom of the hierarchy that the price of speaking was too high. That ends. I looked back at Kelrick. The ward stones are damaged and need rebuilding. That work starts today. I need Osric's archive records. 3 people who know the Southern Ridge and whatever materials the old records specify for boundary reconstruction. You will have them, Kelrick said. The ward stones took 11 days to rebuild. I am telling you that up front because the stories that get passed down about moments like this tend to compress the aftermath into something clean and immediate. The crisis ends. The structure changes. The world reorganizes itself overnight. That is not how it works. What actually happens is 11 days of cold physical labor on an exposed ridgeline in midwinter, hauling granite, mixing the binding compound that Osric's archive records described in a language 3 centuries old that took him 2 days alone to translate accurately. Arguments about the correct spacing between stones. A moment on the 7th day when the first stone we had reset cracked along its base because the ground beneath it had been compromised by the frost-sustained pressure, and we had to start that section over from nothing. Halric was there every day. So were Corwin and Thane, 2 hunters who knew the Southern Ridge better than anyone else in the pack, and who worked without complaint in conditions that made the work genuinely miserable. Osric came up on the 3rd day with his translations and stayed, sitting on a flat rock wrapped in 4 layers of fur, reading instructions aloud and occasionally correcting our technique with the precise authority of a man who has never laid a stone in his life, but has read extensively about the theory of it. Voss carried stone. Every day. He arrived at first light and he worked until dark, and he did not speak unless spoken to, and he did not complain, and he did not explain himself. His hands blistered in the first 3 days and calloused in the next 4, and by the 8th day he was handling granite with the competence of a man whose body has accepted the work, even if his mind is still negotiating with what the work means. He was not pleasant, he was not transformed, but he was present and he was working. And on the 9th day, I caught him with his palm pressed flat against one of the set stones, eyes closed, feeling for the frequency the way I had taught Halric to check the alignment. He pulled his hand back when he saw me looking, but he did not deny what he had been doing. Kelric came every day too. He did not supervise. He did not direct. He carried stone. He mixed binding compound. He held anchor points in position while the compound set, which required standing completely still for 20 minutes at a stretch in wind that had opinions about being out in it. And he did it without being asked. The first morning, he had shown up at the ridge at dawn with his work gloves already on, and I had looked at him and said nothing, and he had picked up a stone and found the place where it was needed, and that had been the beginning of a new kind of conversation between us. One conducted mostly without words, the language of people who are building something together and discovering in the building of it what they are to each other. On the fourth day, Tormund came. He arrived mid-morning, without announcement, stood at the edge of the work area watching, and then picked up a stone. Nobody said anything about it. By the afternoon, he was working alongside Halric, and whatever had lived in his face when he looked at me before, that reflexive dismissal, that particular expression of a man who has already filed you under a category and does not intend to reconsider, was not entirely gone, but it had developed a crack in it. Something coming through the crack that I did not yet have a name for. I chose to find that sufficient for now. The 11th day was the one that mattered, the prime anchor stone, the largest of the 7, the one positioned at the apex of the ridge's curve, whose placement required the most precise alignment because it carried the majority of the filtration frequency. We had said it twice already. The first time the alignment was fractionally wrong, and I felt it through the passive pulse. A slight dissonance like a string tuned almost but not quite to pitch. The second time, the binding compound had been mixed at the wrong ratio and had not set overnight. The third time, we did it in silence, all of us understanding that this was the attempt that had to hold. Kelric and I set the stone together, his hands on one face, mine on the other, Halric and Corwin steadying the base, Osric reading the final alignment instruction in a voice that was trying very hard not to betray how cold he was. We moved it by increments, feeling for the position the way you feel for a lock's mechanism when you do not have the key, but you have patience and the understanding that there is a correct position and you will find it. It settled. I felt it through my palms before I heard it. A low resonant click that traveled up through the stone and into my hands, and from there into the frequency of the pendant at my chest. The two signals aligning, snapping into phase. The pendant went from its usual warm oscillation to something stronger and more definite, a clear sustained note rather than a hum. The runes on the stone's face lit blue-white. Osric made a sound that was entirely undignified and entirely appropriate. The light spread from the prime stone outward along the boundary line to the adjacent stones, each one catching the frequency as it arrived. Each set of runes illuminating in sequence until all 7 were running, steady and clear in the gray winter light. The boundary filter came up like a lamp being turned to full wick, the full containment frequency restored, the territory sealed. I stood with my hand still on the prime stone and pressed my forehead briefly against the surface, just for a moment, thinking about my mother standing somewhere on this ridge, her hands on stone, her pendant warm at her throat, the same frequency running through her that was running through me now. She had known this was coming. She had prepared for it the only way she could, by making sure the thing that was needed would exist when it was needed. That is it, I said. We are done. The pack gathered that evening without being asked. People simply came, drawn by some collective instinct toward warmth and proximity that 11 days of crisis had sharpened into something more deliberate than habit. By the time the main fire was burning, the courtyard was full. Children on stone ledges, elders in chairs carried from the great hall, warriors standing in the back with cups of something hot. Kelrick stood at the fire. I stood beside him. Not behind, not at a respectful distance, beside. Close enough that our shoulders were a foot apart. Close enough that anyone looking could read the spatial language of it clearly. Osric spoke first because Osric had apparently decided that the restoration of the ward stones was a historical event of sufficient significance to require formal documentation, and he was going to read his notes aloud whether anyone had requested this or not. He read them with the exact level of detail you would expect from a man who has spent 3 centuries keeping records. By the 3rd paragraph, 2 children had fallen asleep, and Tormund was studying the middle distance with the focused expression of a man practicing patience. When Osric finished, Kelrick spoke. He did not repeat what he had said at the morning assembly 11 days ago. That had been said plainly, and saying it again would have turned it from honesty into performance. Instead he said, "The boundary stones are rebuilt, and the ward stones are running at full strength. The southern ridge is sealed. The territory is secure. Going forward, the pack operates with 2 voices at the council fire, mine and Revna's. Not the same voice, not an agreement to always reach the same conclusion. 2 different voices representing 2 different kinds of knowledge, both of which this pack requires to function safely. If they disagree, the disagreement is examined, not silenced." He sat down. I did not make a speech. I had thought about it during the 11 days on the ridge, composed and discarded a dozen versions of it. Too much like a claim of victory. Too much like a public accounting of grievances. Too much like the kind of thing that sounds right in the moment and starts to curdle into something else in the weeks after. What I said instead was this: the frost will come again. Not soon. The cycle is a long one. But it will come. And when it does, the pack that survives, it will be the one that has spent the intervening century practicing the habit of listening to things it does not want to hear. That is the work, not the ward stones, not the boundary filter. The habit. Everything else is just maintenance. Someone started a fire story. The old kind. A long, rambling narrative about a hunter and a storm and a decision made in the dark that turned out to be the right one. The kind of story where the point is not the ending, but the telling. The accumulated warmth of voices and firelight, and the specific comfort of a people who have come through something difficult sitting together in the ordinary evening on the other side of it. Later, when the crowd had thinned and the fire had burned low, and the children had been carried inside by parents, careful not to wake them, Kelrick and I stood alone by the dying embers, the courtyard quiet around us. The ward stones glowing faintly on the ridge, visible through the gap in the fortress wall, blue-white and steady. He reached out slowly, his hand moving with the careful deliberation of a man who is doing something for the first time and wants to do it correctly. His fingers found the pendant where it hung against my collarbone. He touched the silver crescent, felt the warmth of it, the tiny oscillation that had been running through it and through me since the night I was born. His fingertips rested there for a moment, against the warm silver, against the skin beneath it, and neither of us moved. "I will not make that mistake again," he said quietly. "Not the formal declaration of the morning assembly." Something said at the volume of two people standing close together in firelight, the voice he used when the king was not required, and the man was enough. "I know," I said. He did not move his hand. I did not ask him to. "Revna Frostwood," he said. Not a question, not quite an announcement, just the name spoken once, the way you speak something you want to make real by saying it aloud. In pack law, the naming requires a witness. There were 300 of them. The name was real. I was no longer Revna Quiet Dusk, the strange Omega who stood at the edges of celebrations pressing her palms against walls and saying things nobody wanted to hear. I was the Frostwood, the anchor point of the territory's boundary filter and the second voice at the council fire, and the woman who had walked out of exile and walked back in, and neither of those things had broken what needed to be unbroken. The fire burned low. The courtyard cooled. Somewhere on the southern ridge, Voss would be arriving at first light for the monthly boundary maintenance that I had assigned as permanent duty. Somewhere in the archive, Osric was writing the account that would survive all of us. Somewhere in the lower quarters, Brielle was sleeping with her son, warm against her chest in a room that was warm because the ward stones were running and the territory was whole. I pressed my palm flat against the courtyard stone. Warm. Just warm. The honest warmth of 300 lives going about the work of being alive. Their heat bleeding into the stone and the air the way warmth always bleeds from anything that is living and whole. No drain below it. No patience underneath it, waiting for a weakness in the seal. Just the earth doing what the earth does when the balance is what it should be. The winter continued. It would for months yet. Cold mornings and frozen pipes and the long work of keeping 300 wolves fed and warm through the dark part of the year. The ordinary, difficult labor of survival that has nothing mystical about it and requires no ancient mechanisms to make it meaningful. But we were listening now. And for the first time in longer than anyone in that courtyard could remember, the pack sat around a fire in the middle of winter and was not afraid of what the cold might mean. That was enough. That was, it turned out, everything.